Alrighty, we are now live. This is cool. Well, good morning, everyone. Today we are speaking with Joseph Csicsila. He is a professor at Eastern Michigan University, and he is the editor of the Mark Twain Circular. Hi, Joe.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. So today we're going to talk about your relationship with Mark Twain, how you got into focusing on Mark Twain as your studies. So the first question would be, what's your earliest memory of reading Twain?
Well, my earliest memory of reading Twain was actually seeing a film. I think it was Tom Sawyer or something like that as a kid. It was a pretty popular version of it, I think, from the 30s. And what I remember most about that is not the things that are typically associated with the novel, like the fence painting scene or, the kids messing with their teachers or their Sunday school teachers, but the darker elements of the novel, the graveyard murder, Injun Joe, and the way that the kids were terrified. But yeah, so that's my earliest memory, probably 7 or 8, and then I went and read the novel pretty soon after that, I think.
Cool. I myself read Tom Sawyer and I thought it was great. So, when did you first encounter Mark Twain in the classroom? Was it high school? Was it middle school?
I don't remember him before college. Actually, it was my last semester as an undergraduate. I was an English major. I had planned to go on to graduate school, and I had already decided to go to Auburn University, and I had a class on Mark Twain with a guy at the University of Michigan who turned out to be a pretty important influence on me. Became a mentor of some kind, and I'm still in contact with him. We just wrote a book together 6-7 years ago. But in any event, I had him my last semester as an undergraduate in college, and I took to him immediately. And thankfully, Auburn University had a Twain scholar there, and so it was just a natural transition. And from that point forward, I remember being pretty committed. I don't know, as a student, as a researcher to Mark Twain. Yeah, so it was pretty late in the game.
Okay. What's the next question? What was your dissertation topic and who directed your dissertation?
Well, my dissertation director was a person by the name of Joe McCullough. He's out at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. He's also a Twain scholar. I didn't write a dissertation on Mark Twain per se. There's a chapter on Mark Twain, but my dissertation was on the topic of American literature anthologies, of all things. Those big books that we make students buy for those survey classes, the Norton Anthology and that sort of thing. What I did is I actually, the book is a study, or the dissertation was a study of the history of these things. They show up in classrooms back in the 1920s, really, for the first time. And the idea was to take a look at what was included in those anthologies and try and make some connections to what we call the canon, which is this list. There's no committee working behind the scenes, but it's this general impression of who's an important writer, who's a major writer, who's not a major writer, and try and track that over time by looking at the contents of the table of contents in these anthologies. And so I didn't know what I was going to find, and so Mark Twain, for instance, one of the things that surprised me is that if you look at the history of him in these anthologies, what we see today, Huckleberry Finn, Life on the Mississippi, those kinds of those stories and that part of his career that focuses on the Mississippi River and mid-19th century small town America. That's what we see today. Those weren't what were considered Mark Twain's most important or even most characteristic works back in the 1920s. He wrote a bunch of travel books as a young writer, and so a travel book is you go on a vacation or a tour of Europe, you write about it, and people buy that book, most of whom could never afford to travel to Europe, and so they experience Europe vicariously through your writing. It's a very popular style of book in the 19th century, kind of like the Travel Channel would be today, I suppose, for us. And so, his travel books were very popular and, were thought to be his most important contribution to American literature. And it wasn't until the 1950s that you really see Huckleberry Finn start showing up in these textbooks. And then in the last 20 or 30 years, his writings that deal with race in particular have been very popular. But again, these were nowhere on the radar back in the 40s and 50s. And so I dealt with 30 or 40 writers in this dissertation. Mark Twain was one of them. And you see those kinds of interesting patterns, unexpected patterns with most American writers. Yeah, so that kind of launched me into my career as a professor, I suppose. That dissertation became a book in 2004, and and so I moved into different areas of Mark Twain since then.
Okay, so speaking of Mark Twain's popularity changing over the years, how has your impressions of Mark Twain and his work changed over the years?
That's an interesting question. As a young teacher, as a young scholar, I think it's the tendency to approach, and this is me, I suppose I'm speaking for other people, but I see this in my peers, I see this in my students. You approach your subjects very clinically, very scholarly-like. And so early on, for example, I would teach Mark Twain from a very detached perspective, write about him from a very detached perspective, and it wasn't until I started, well, it actually goes back, I can date it, in 2002, I took 20 students from Eastern Michigan, 10 undergrads and 10 graduate students, to his home, actually his summer home in Elmira, New York, and I taught a one-week compressed course on Mark Twain right there on his porch. And it changed the way that I see Mark Twain, the way that I respond to Mark Twain. For example, I was on the first day of class. What most people do is they sort of cover the biography, and so you go back and he was born on this date. He lived here in this period. He did this in the this period of his life, and then he dies in 1910. When Mark Twain was in his 50s, he experienced a couple of really profound personal tragedies. He went bankrupt, for example, wiped him out. He was a very wealthy guy, very successful writer, and in the early 1890s, he was wiped out, partly by the economy, partly by some bad decision making, partly by things out of his control too. And then 2 years later, his oldest daughter, while he was away in Europe lecturing, which was kind of like a book tour, his daughter, his oldest daughter, she was in her early 20s, died suddenly of spinal meningitis, and it wrecked him. It wrecked his family, and before this class, I had told this story. I had rehearsed the biography in front of students half a dozen times. And again, it was just subject matter. You're talking about Mark Twain and his biography. I remember getting choked up on the porch, and it surprised me. And so Mark Twain, as a subject, became very personalized in that moment. And it's not that I've tried to go back and undo it, but going forward, he was never just a writer. There was a personality, there was a human being, I guess, behind the material. And so that's the chief way that my view of Twain has changed. And that's important because if we're talking about a book like Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and we're asking, how invested was Mark Twain in the politics of the subject matter, race, for example, in the 19th century. This is not a guy who's just writing about a subject that happens to be on everyone's radar in the 19th century. He cared personally about this subject, and very deeply, by the way. And so understanding him as a human being, or considering him as a human being, as a personality, as a real person, that changes the way that you, I think, teach it and read Mark Twain and even write about him, if that makes sense.
Excuse me. Have you grown to dislike anything about Mark Twain?
No, no. He's an endlessly fascinating guy. He's wonderfully human too. I think he's complicated, and he's complex. He was not. So we look back at Mark Twain, and we think about the white suits, and we think about this wonderful sense of humor, and we imagine what it would have been like, how great it would have been to have met him personally and talked to him. I suppose, at least I do. But he was like most writers, most artists, most genius. Was a pretty tough guy to be around. There's a story from the 1880s. He's right in the middle of his career. He's in the middle of writing Huckleberry Finn, and he's trying to find somebody to go on a riverboat tour with him. He's trying to collect material for Huckleberry Finn and another book that he's writing at the time. And you see him writing letter after letter to people he's acquainted with. He's looking for someone to go on this trip with, buddies, anyone. And one after another, you see them coming up with excuses why they can't go. William Dean Howells, who's a pretty major writer from the period, was a close friend of Twain. I think it was him. It might have been somebody else. Writes in response, "I wish I would have received the letter just yesterday, because I booked travel to Europe, and I'm going to be gone, and so I can't go on this trip with you." And one after another, people were responding to him this way. He ended up forcing his publisher, I think, to go with him on this trip, just to have someone, a warm body with him. He was a difficult person to get along with. But anything you would dislike about Mark Twain would be the things you would dislike about people generally. He had an awful temper. He was, terribly impatient with people. But you see these things in, the people in your own lives, I suppose. So, no, again, he's become more human. And from time to time you see things you kind of wince at, the way he responds to people, the way he treats people around him. But no, for the most part, he's a really interesting guy. Really interesting guy.
Okay. And with that being said about him having a temper and impatient, is there any common misperception about Mark Twain that you wish to kind of clarify or debunk?
Yeah, the first, kind of talked about it just a little bit. He was a deeply empathetic human being. It's possible, I suppose, to look at what he writes and, race, for example, to see him as just joining in a conversation that was popular in his day. He cared deeply about race. He is maybe one of the most remarkable examples of a reconstructed 19th century American. His father owned a slave, maybe more than that. Growing up, he had a very cavalier attitude about race, about slavery. He was taught in his church that the Bible condoned it, and he was very flip about the way that African Americans were treated early on in his career. But he marries into a family that was deeply committed to abolition before the Civil War and civil rights after the Civil War. Abolition before, civil rights after. In fact, this family, the Langdon family in Elmira, New York, was a stop on the Underground Railroad going into Canada. Twain's father-in-law was a personal friend of Frederick Douglass, and he knew the major players in the abolitionist and post-Civil War civil rights movement. And Twain married into this family. And when his father-in-law died, soon after that marriage, Twain moved his family, his wife, and his I think he had a couple of young kids at this point, to Hartford, Connecticut. And Hartford, Connecticut was a hotbed of very liberal political thinking. His next-door neighbor was Harriet Beecher Stowe, and the people that he socialized with, in his late 30s, early 40s, which is the period where he's preparing to write Huckleberry Finn, made a deep impression on him. And if you look at the material that he produces around the time that he's writing Huckleberry Finn, I don't think there's any question that you come away with the clear impression that he was deeply committed to African American equality in the late 19th century. We're right in the middle of Jim Crow, and Huckleberry Finn is as much about slavery superficially as it is a commentary on the way that African Americans are viewed and treated in late 19th century culture. So, one misimpression that Mark Twain could be a racist. You hear this quite a bit when talk of Huckleberry Finn and contemporary curriculums comes up. It's not possible, having read his reflections on race, especially in the 1870s, 1880s. That's a huge misimpression that people, I think, have of Mark Twain. And the other is that he was, an accidental genius. Lots of people have the impression that here's a guy who left school when he was 12 years old because of circumstance. His father dies, and so his mother has to pull him out of school just to contribute to the family. And so that he comes about, his thinking, he comes about his gifts as a writer just accidentally, and nothing could be farther from the truth. We've been able to reconstruct his personal library, the books he had in his home, and it turns out that there are 4,000 or 5,000 books, possibly, that he probably read over the course of his adult life. I mean, if you do the math, so we're talking 40 years to read 4,000 books. That's 1,000 books every 10 years. That's 100 books a year. that's 10 books a month. That's a lot of reading. And he read everything: history, philosophy, literature, science. This was a self-educated man maybe, again, one of the most miraculous cases of a self-educated individual in at least American literary history. Very smart guy, knew what he was talking about, and the affect of this very sloppy, very slow, very hickish, you know, what's the term that we use? This sort of backwoods philosopher. These are all constructions. He was very consciously presenting himself this way. He was a very serious and very deep thinker, and so that's another impression I think that would surprise a lot of people.
Awesome. So real quick, because I know you mentioned your book earlier, and you were just talking about Mark Twain and books you read, what is the title of your book?
So I have two books on Mark Twain. The one came out in 2009, and this is just a collection of essays on his last novel. I edited this with a friend of mine who teaches in Chicago. This is called, if I remember the title correctly, Centenary Reflections on Mark Twain's number 44, The Mysterious Stranger. Title pretty much takes up the entire cover of the book. But number 44, The Mysterious Stranger, is his last novel. He left it unpublished at the time of his death. He finished writing it in 1908, and so in 2008, some of us who have done some research on this book thought it was time that we get some people who have done work on Twain to say a few things about this important book. My second book on Mark Twain is called Heretical Fictions, and I co-wrote this with actually my undergraduate advisor at Michigan, a guy named Larry Burkove, who's retired in the last 10 years, but we sat down in the mid-2000s and attacked this topic of Mark Twain and how his religious thinking shows through in his major writings. He was raised a Presbyterian Calvinist, which in the 19th century was pretty fire and brimstone stuff, a pretty dour view of God, a pretty pessimistic view of human beings generally, not a very uplifting view of the cosmos, to put it mildly. And Larry and I think that this is an important dimension of his writing. It's important to see where some of his ideas come from. So yeah, Heretical Fictions came out in 2010. That's the last book.
I'm sorry, my cat.
Oh, that's okay.
She just, well, it has been really great talking to you. I feel like I've learned a lot.
Okay, thanks.
I have to go get the cat. Okay, well, thank
Mark
you for
Twain
your
loved
time.
cats, by the way.
That's always important. Everyone should love cats. Well, it's been really fun. Thank you for your time. And
Okay.
you have a nice day.
Okay, we'll see you around. Thanks.
Bye.